I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 98 of EORadioShow. This is the fourth in a series of episodes where we talk about fraud at nonprofit organizations. With the expert insight of Sly Atayee, a director at national accounting firm BDO USA, and a certified fraud examiner, we started with case studies of fraud at nonprofit organizations in episode 94. Then in episode 95, we talked about 3 immediate steps an organization can take to mitigate fraud risks. And in episode 96, Sly walked us through several big picture fraud prevention techniques for exempt organizations. Listen in today as we wrap up the series as we ask a certified fraud examiner to answer listener questions sent to our mailbox at EORadioShow. Welcome to the EORadioShow, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EORadioShow. We're glad you're here. Today, I welcome back Sly Atayee, a director at BDO USA, where his work focuses on assisting exempt organizations with various aspects of forensic analysis and investigations. BDO is an international accounting firm that delivers assurance, tax, and advisory services to clients throughout the United States and around the globe. Sly has led numerous forensic analyses for exempt organizations, including fieldwork domestically in the U.S. and internationally in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. He regularly supports his clients with forensic investigations, financial process redesign, fraud prevention and mitigation, internal control assessments, complex cost recovery calculations, policy and procedure development and support, and more. Sly has experience supporting in litigation matters, substantiating costs through the collection of supporting documentation, and performing data analytics in order to calculate and quantify losses and damages. So welcome back, Sly. It's great to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Cynthia. I'm excited for our last episode in the series.
Great. So we got some really good questions from listeners. I think there's 7 or 8 of them. So let's start right in. The first question was, what are the most common types of fraud that occur in nonprofit organizations, and how can they be detected early?
It's a great question. So despite a lot of articles or media that you'll see that talks about the latest cyber hack, right, or something that's a little bit more juicy, I guess you can call it, the most prevalent type of fraud that occurs for any organization is still occupational fraud. And that means an employee stealing from the organization that they are employed by, right? And that's true for nonprofit organizations as well as other types of organizations. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners puts out a biennial report every 2 years that basically gives some good data points on this, but it's been the same thing for years and years and years. And so it doesn't change. And it's, it makes sense because you consider the number of people that are in the workforce globally. There's a huge pool of people. There's a lot of people that have the potential to do this and to commit some sort of fraud against the organization that they're employed by.
Right. And they have the immediate access. The cyber hackers and the outside bad actors, it's a little bit harder. So how can they be detected early? What's the best practice to try to stop it as soon as it starts?
I think that it's good to look at a couple of the stats that are in that report, and I'll put it in the show link as well. But there's a couple of stats that are really troubling for exempt organizations. And I think number one is that exempt organizations have the lowest rate of fraud training for their employees out of any of the other industries that were tested or sampled in that report. This will relate back to the kind of detecting early question I promise in a second. But orgs that did not have fraud awareness training lost 2 times the amount in fraud cases than orgs that did have training. Obviously, it's twice as bad. But even more importantly, and more directly related to your question, exempt organizations that provided fraud awareness training uncovered frauds 2.5 times faster than orgs that did not have training. You want to detect fraud earlier. Obviously, it's good to have controls that prevent the fraud in the first place, but it's good to arm and inform your employees on what are some of those things they need to be looking out for so they can report it up the chain.
If you've got that training, maybe that stops bad actors from trying because they figure they're more likely to get caught.
Exactly. Yep.
So that all makes sense. So question number 2, and this is kind of a logical follow-on. A listener asks, how can we implement effective internal controls without significantly increasing our costs? I mean, nonprofits, they never have enough money to do what they want to do. So what makes it the most cost effective?
Yeah, I'll say, and kind of relating back to our prior episodes, having a good system of controls will effectively reduce fraud risk across the board. And so it's not just one step or one activity that will help you reduce fraud risk and do it in a cost-effective manner. You have to have a series of steps that you're kind of executing throughout the year and then also monitoring and then reassessing. And if you think about it from that perspective, it's a little bit less burdensome where you're not having to stop what you're doing for an entire month to assess fraud risk. It really is a continuous process you should be doing throughout the year.
Can you think of, are there any automated tools? I'm thinking of coming up everywhere to make our lives easier. Have you seen any that are available or that might be coming soon that would make this easier or cheaper? Cheaper is the main point.
Yeah. I mean, there are some, I'd say in the bigger, fancier kind of ERP systems, like accounting systems, they're starting to incorporate that more and more. I'll say that for, a mid to small size nonprofit organization, they're usually not going to have access to that. And I'll say AI in general for, besides it already being implemented in the software somewhere, I feel like at this point, it's still just better for producing language, either synthesizing language or expanding language, but not as much for doing analysis. I think down the line, it'll come, but I don't think there's any really affordable or attainable technologies out there that would allow nonprofits to kind of do that in a way that's cost effective again.
Yeah. So it still comes down to human judgment and human intuition and human understanding of how this happens. Question number 3. What role does organizational culture play in preventing fraud? Oh, yeah, this is also a follow-on. Makes sense in the context. So organizational culture, and how do you foster a culture of integrity? Yeah,
it's a great question. Again, if you go back to one of our prior episodes, we talked about the COSO principles and the one specific principle around control environment. It's a huge piece. Obviously, it's the environment that you set within your organization, and it relates back to 2 points of the fraud triangle that we discussed previously, right? And the fraud triangle is 3 different points. It's the pressure an employee or a fraudster feels, the opportunity they have, and then the rationalization. Pressure, I don't think you can really dictate as much. It's kind of an external force, but I think that there's 2 things you could do to affect the opportunity a fraudster has, as well as the rationalization, right? And, in terms of opportunity, if the employee has to think, will I get away with this? And if the answer is no, then there is no opportunity there, right? You take that away. In terms of rationalization, when you have that tone at the top, that's really key as part of a control environment, that employee will ask themselves, is this right or wrong? The example that's been set at the highest level of the organization that kind of trickles down, that should stick in their mind. And so I think that in terms of how organizational culture plays into this, I think that you're basically embedding more and more questions into the employee's mind that will make them
pause
or think twice on whether or not they should do it. And I shouldn't just say employee, but just fraudster in general.
So thinking of employees, can you identify some red flags? This is another listener question. Some red flags that might indicate fraudulent activity within our organization. What should they look for?
The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the ACFE, it puts out reports all the time. And I think the most recent report, it had the top 5 red flags that we should be looking out for. So number 1 is living beyond your means. So if an employee, we've had fraud cases like this before where an employee shows up to work, driving a really fancy car, or all of a sudden wearing really expensive clothing, or talking about all of these side ventures they have outside of work. And I think in one case, some guy bought a hotel and he was like a staff level accountant, and everybody was really confused. How do you afford an entire hotel?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big leap.
Yeah. And so that's a big one. Number 2 would be financial difficulties. This kind of plays into that fraud triangle, that pressure point in the fraud triangle. They're having difficulties at home. Sometimes there's medical bills, things like that. That's a red flag to look out for, although that one's a little bit harder, obviously. being unusually close with a vendor or a customer. If you notice that an employee who's involved in purchasing is very chummy with the subcontractor that they're working with, and you're starting to see some anomalies in terms of the contracts and that subcontractors winning a lot of those contracts when they should have been competitive, that might be a red flag. Number 4 would be control issues or like unwillingness to share. I think we talked about this on the first episode where a lot of our cases actually come from either an employee leaving the organization and the new employee comes in and then starts looking at things and says, this doesn't look right. Or somebody goes on vacation and then somebody else takes over that role. And again, they notice right away that things don't smell right or they don't tie out. And so that's pretty common. And then number 5 is just general irritability. This is obviously a hard one to dictate. And,
yeah, some of us are just irritable, but other than that.
Sometimes just having a bad day or you didn't have your coffee there,
enough
right?
yet. Yeah.
But, again, I think like on a consistent basis, you notice that they're not getting along with other people and they seem to be wanting to kind of keep things closed off for themselves, could be potentially another red flag.
Yeah. And I think part of that unusually close with vendor customer makes me think of conflicts of interest. And I know conflict of interest policy covers a whole lot of stuff that has nothing to do with fraud, but employing family members or paying related entities, same kind of thing. I think that's a subset of your unusually close with vendor or customer.
Yeah. And that's a key point of your control environment as well, right? Your policies and procedures. You need to make sure that those are very clear and it's established what type of conduct is expected from your employees, especially your employees that are involved in like things like purchasing, right? Your conflict of interest needs to make sure that it applies to them. And you could even have them sign like a separate document that's just specific for people who do purchasing.
Good idea. So next question. What steps should we take if we suspect fraud has occurred? What do we do first? Confront the person? What's the best first step?
Well, hopefully most organizations never have to do this. I guess I'll say that first. But, I'd say like generally it's kind of assessing the situation, not jumping to conclusions, not jumping to making decisions, rash decisions. You want to assess the risk. Right. You want to understand like what you're dealing with. Where is the information coming from? How credible is it? You should have a set process for that, even a policy. A lot of organizations have policies on how they handle investigations. But I'd say also like your OGC, if you have in-house counsel as well as external counsel, those are great resources to reach out to. And even especially if you realize that, the risk has gone way past what you originally considered, if it's donor funding or federal funding, for example, like those are usually things that trigger the need to reach out to external counsel. And then if it gets to that point, usually we'll come into play as well, working alongside external counsel. You can contact, certified fraud examiner or somebody else to help assess the situation and really help get to the details and bring that independent point of view.
Yeah, that reminded me, I had a situation years ago where I think it was my client contact was the interim CEO and came in and somehow became aware that there was something going on. And the bad actor actually fled the country before anything could be done. And the assets were all gone. And I don't know realistically how you deal with that other than trying to talk to counsel right away before the suspicion is raised by where the bad actor thinks they need to do something immediate. Anyway, I digress a little bit, but that was good advice on first steps is assessing it with professionals who've been there and done that.
Exactly.
Another listener asks, how can we conduct a fraud risk assessment and how often should that be done?
Yeah, it's a great question. So not to beat the same drum
it's okay.
consistently, as part of your building of your system of controls, risk assessment is one of those components, one of the principles of the COSO system of controls framework. You should be conducting regular risk assessments, at least annually, and fraud is a component of that. It's not the only risk your organization most likely faces, right? There are other risks, but I think that's where it should be embedded first. If you wanted to do something more specific, the ACFE, again, I'll put some links into the show notes as well. The ACFE has some good resources. I'll say they're pretty rudimentary, right? They're things that you could probably come up on your own with, but they are helpful, right? In some cases, like you could develop a risk register and the ACFE has a template for that. And it just gives you really simple headers. It at least gives you a starting point on like, what are the things that I should actually think about?
Well, great. That sounds like a terrific resource. And yes, we'll definitely put that in the show notes. The final question from a listener. Do you have a view on whether reimbursing personal credit cards or actually issuing company credit cards, which of those two approaches is more likely to foster or enable fraud? I have my own thoughts on that, but I'm curious yours.
This is a very close issue for me where I've dealt with this so many times. I feel like I have a pretty passionate take about this. But in terms of like whether that affects your fraud risk, I don't think it should, right? Because your organization should still be doing like a pretty in-depth review of expenses, whether you paid for the credit card yourself or the employee paid for it with their own personal funds and are seeking reimbursement, right? The review should be the same. What changed there is how hard is it going to be for you to get that money back and to reconcile that credit card bill if you're paying the employee's bill. And I think in most exempt organizations I've done work for, they actually pay the bill up front and then they have the employees reconcile the bill later and, submit an expense report or something. If the employee ends up going 6 months, 3 months, whatever it is, without reconciling the bill, the employer has paid and the employer has no idea what was in that charge, right? You don't know if it's an allowable charge or not. From a fraud perspective, I don't think it should, in theory, change the fraud risk, but operationally, it might be harder for you to try to reconcile in a timely fashion. But to that point, again, if you don't know what's in those charges and you don't find out for 6 months, you might be sitting on a bill that you've paid for that had unallowable expenses in there. And so you won't know that until the employee has reconciled their expenses.
Yeah.
I'll let you give your take as well.
Well, yeah, I can see why employees that are expected to travel a lot, or they may not have sufficient credit limit, or they may not want it on, for various reasons, people don't want to charge things on their own credit card. It just always raises the hair on the back of my neck when I see a whole lot of staff people with a company credit card and not using their own. It's just so tempting. And I've seen a number of situations where that goes sideways pretty fast.
I've had several cases where, because the fraud incident that we came in to investigate involved some sort of P card or credit card, somebody in the board is just like, we need to get rid of these cards altogether. And the employer basically eliminates all cards and says, people need to submit expense reports if you want reimbursement for expenses. Obviously, it's a pretty drastic measure to take, and you have a lot of factors to consider there, but it does eliminate a certain portion of risk. So I understand why the decision may have been made.
Yeah, or at least limit that company card to very senior persons with, for big dollar amounts. So any final closing thoughts as we close out this series? I hope it's been really helpful to the listeners, and it certainly has been interesting to talk about. I wouldn't say fun, because these topics are not exactly, heartwarming, but they're so important to nonprofits. Any last words?
If we're talking about fraud prevention and mitigation, start with a basic framework and kind of build up from there. It's not something that you're just going to do one time and forget about it till next year. It's a continuous process. Start small if you need to. I think half measures are better than no measures, right? So take some steps at least. And even if you don't have the people right now, maybe you'll have some more resources in the future. And so I think it's all about just keeping it top of mind and taking consistent action against it versus needing a big fancy process or needing to hire 10 people. You don't need to do any of that, but you'd be surprised how much of the risk you can mitigate by just taking some of the simple steps or putting a good infrastructure in place and then being consistent with that infrastructure.
Yeah, and getting that training going.
Exactly.
That all is great advice. Well, I can't thank you enough for being willing to do these 4 episodes with me. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll find something else to talk about in the future. Maybe we'll do an annual update or biannual update.
Yeah, I should have said thank you to obviously yourself, Cynthia, and to Pharrell Braun for having me on. I was expecting to get on and talk about a couple of really small subjects, and we turned it into an entire series. So I'm really happy that it worked out that way. And thank you again for having me on.
Oh, it's been great. We have set this aside in a separate playlist on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in all of these episodes with Sly, take a look at the show notes for that. And with that, I'll wrap up this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for the links we mentioned. And there are other organized playlists on the YouTube channel as well for other topics listeners might be interested in. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.